My name is Prince Khalid bin Fahd al-Rashid, and on 25th December, Christmas morning, I stood in white execution garments on the grounds beneath the Saudi capital, my hands shackled behind my back, watching the executioner raise his blade with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this 100 times before. The witnesses stood in rigid silence. State officials checked their watches. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. But in the seconds before royal blood was scheduled to stain the sand, something happened that would force an entire kingdom to ask whether some powers transcend even the authority of kings. Let me tell you how a prince groomed for governance came to kneel before an executioner for speaking 3 forbidden words on the most dangerous day of the year. I was born into one of the most formidable branches of the Saudi royal family, the Al-Rashid line, a bloodline that had governed provinces, negotiated oil contracts worth billions, and shaped the religious landscape of the kingdom for 3 generations. My childhood unfolded behind palace walls where Quranic verses echoed through air-conditioned corridors, where my father's word could determine the fate of entire cities, and where servants anticipated my needs before I could voice them. Prince Fahd bin Abdullah al-Rashid, my father, was not merely wealthy, he was power incarnate, a man whose approval religious scholars sought and whose displeasure provinces feared. From the moment I could form words, I memorized Quranic verses with flawless pronunciation. By age 8, I could recite entire surahs during Friday prayers while scholars nodded their approval. By 12, imams predicted I would become one of the kingdom's great religious leaders, perhaps even advising the royal court on matters of Islamic law. I fasted during Ramadan with unwavering discipline, led prayers at our family mosque, and studied under sheikhs who taught that devotion was measured in perfection. My trajectory was predetermined with crystalline clarity. I would assume a governorship by 25, join the Royal Advisory Council by 35, and eventually oversee religious and administrative affairs for the southwestern territories. I had access to everything power could provide, wealth that measured itself in palaces rather than bank accounts, influence that opened doors from Riyadh to London, and a family name that commanded instant deference across the entire Middle East. Yet beneath the golden surface of Allah's blessings, something gnawed at my soul like hunger that no feast could satisfy. To us, truth was beautifully simple. Islam was the straight path, and everything outside it was dangerous deviation designed to lead believers into hellfire. I performed every ritual flawlessly. I gave the prescribed charity. I prayed 5 times daily without fail. But somewhere beneath my perfect recitations and religious victories, an unbearable emptiness grew deeper with each passing year. It wasn't doubt. I would never have named it that. It was more like thirst that no amount of prayer could quench, a silence that followed every supplication like an unanswered question hanging in the air. Why did absolute certainty feel like a prison with golden bars? Everything shattered in January 2024 during what should have been a routine diplomatic assignment in London. As part of the kingdom's effort to strengthen cultural ties with British institutions, I was sent to complete advanced studies at the London School of Economics, a carefully calculated move to polish my credentials before assuming greater responsibilities. My days filled with economic theory and international relations. My evenings filled with official receptions and diplomatic protocol. But London was different from home. There were no religious police monitoring my movements. No family members scrutinizing my associations. No palace walls confining my curiosity. One evening in midwinter, when frost covered the city and Christmas lights transformed the streets into something almost magical, I wandered away from the diplomatic quarter seeking escape from another formal dinner. I found myself on a quiet street near King's Cross Station, where a small independent bookstore glowed with warm light against the December darkness. I told myself I was simply exploring the neighborhood. Nothing more. But when I stepped inside to escape the cold, my eyes fell upon a display table near the history section. Among books about European wars and British monarchs sat a single volume with a simple cover and a title that made my pulse quicken. The Life of Jesus, a historical and spiritual biography. I froze, my hand hovering over the book like it was a live wire. Everything in my training screamed danger. Jesus was a prophet in Islam, respected but firmly placed in a hierarchy beneath Muhammad, his message believed to have been corrupted by Christians into blasphemous claims of divinity. To read a Christian perspective on Jesus was to risk contamination, to invite theological confusion, to flirt with the very apostasy that carried only one sentence under our law. I should have walked away without a second thought. My education, my position, my entire future demanded I turn my back on that table and return to the safety of diplomatic protocol. Instead, something inside me whispered with a voice I had never heard before. Look closer. I told myself it was purely academic interest, understanding Western perspectives on shared prophetic figures to better defend Islamic truth. Nothing more than intellectual due diligence. But the moment I opened those pages in a quiet corner of that bookstore, my eyes fell upon words that struck me like lightning splitting an ancient tree. Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Service? Ransom? A God who came not to be feared but to sacrifice? These concepts crashed against everything I had been taught about divinity. Allah was transcendent, distant, demanding perfection. But here was a description of God stepping down into human suffering, close enough to touch lepers and weep at graves and bleed on wood. That night, I bought the book and smuggled it back to my flat like contraband more dangerous than weapons. For 6 weeks, I conducted secret reading sessions after midnight, when London slept and the only witnesses were shadows and streetlights. I dismissed my assigned security detail with fabricated excuses about needing privacy for exam preparation. I locked my door and traced the accounts of Jesus with trembling fingers, his compassion for outcasts, his forgiveness of enemies, his claim that he was not just showing the way to God but was himself the way. Every chapter one read shook the foundations of everything I had built my identity upon. This was not the distant Allah who demanded perfection. This was God saying, "Come close. I know you are broken. That's why I came." Within 2 months, something impossible had happened. I believed. But to understand why those words would eventually cost me everything, you need to know what happened next, how a secret book in London became a secret belief in Riyadh, and how that belief would eventually become 3 forbidden words spoken on the most dangerous day of the year. London in winter is nothing like the desert I grew up in. Where Riyadh scorches with relentless sun, London drapes itself in grey mist and early darkness. Where my homeland demands conformity, London hums with 1,000 different voices speaking 1,000 different truths. For the first time in my life, I could walk down a street and be just another man in a crowd. No title, no guards, no eyes reporting my every movement back to palace officials. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying. I threw myself into my studies at first, attending lectures on international economics and diplomatic theory, networking with officials from a dozen nations, playing the role of the perfect Saudi representative. But in the evenings, when formal obligations ended and my security detail believed I was studying in my flat, I would walk. Just walk. Through neighborhoods where church bells rang without fear of prosecution. Past pubs where strangers debated religion and politics without lowering their voices. Along streets decorated with lights that would have been forbidden at home. That's how I found myself near King's Cross Station on that December evening, frost crunching under my shoes, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just escape from another suffocating diplomatic reception where I'd smiled and nodded and pretended to be the prince everyone expected. The bookstore was small, wedged between a coffee shop and a tailor studio, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that seemed to beckon me inside. I told myself I'd just browse for a few minutes. Maybe find something on British history to justify the detour. But when I stepped through the door, my eyes were drawn immediately to a display table near the back. Biography and Faith, read the handwritten sign above it. And there, among books about Gandhi and the Dalai Lama, sat a volume with a plain blue cover and gold lettering. The Life of Jesus, a historical and spiritual biography. I froze. My first instinct was to look around, to make sure no one from the Saudi diplomatic corps was watching. Ridiculous, I know. I was thousands of miles from home in a secular bookstore. But years of surveillance had trained me to constantly check over my shoulder. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings. This was dangerous territory. Jesus was a prophet in Islam, yes, but the Christian version of him was heresy, claims of divinity, of being God's son, of dying for sins. Reading this wasn't just curiosity, it was flirtation with apostasy. But another voice, quieter, deeper, more insistent, whispered, "What are you afraid of? If Islam is truth, one book can't shake it. Unless..." I didn't finish that thought. I picked up the book with trembling hands, paid for it quickly, and smuggled it back to my flat tucked under my coat like contraband more dangerous than weapons. That night, sitting alone in my small apartment with the curtains drawn and the door locked, I opened to the first chapter. I told myself I would skim a few pages, satisfy my curiosity, then put it away and forget about it. But the words wouldn't let me go. The author described Jesus not as a distant prophet delivering laws from on high, but as God stepping down into the mess of human existence. Jesus touched lepers that society had abandoned. He wept at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. He invited children onto his lap when his disciples tried to shoo them away. He sat with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners, not to condemn them, but to offer them something they'd never known, unconditional love. I read about how Jesus forgave the woman caught in adultery when religious leaders wanted to stone her. How he healed on the Sabbath even though it broke religious law, because human suffering mattered more than ritual. How he told his followers that God wasn't keeping score of their failures, but was instead like a father running to embrace a wayward son. This was nothing like the Allah I had grown up with, the distant judge who demanded perfection, who tallied every prayer and weighed every deed, who felt impossibly far away no matter how much I prostrated myself. This Jesus spoke of a God who came close, who entered suffering rather than observing it from heaven, who said, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy-laden, and I will give you rest." Rest. When had I ever felt rest? When had faith ever felt like relief instead of burden? I read until 3 a.m., then lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling with my mind spinning. Over the next 6 weeks, that book became my secret obsession. I would attend my classes and diplomatic functions, play the role of dutiful prince, then rush back to my flat to read more. I started watching Christmas services online, curious about what this celebration actually meant. What I discovered shook me. Christmas wasn't about Western commercialism or cultural imperialism. It was the audacious claim that God had become human, that divinity had stepped into history not with armies and judgment, but as a vulnerable baby born in a stable. God close enough to touch, close enough to bleed. One night, watching a midnight service from a small church in Wales, I heard the priest read words that pierced straight through me. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. Grace. Not performance. Not perfection. Grace. For the first time in my life, God felt near. By the time I boarded my flight back to Riyadh in late November, I carried no physical Bible, no Christian symbols, nothing that customs agents could confiscate. But something had already crossed the border, hidden where no security scanner could detect it. Something had taken root in my heart, and I knew, with growing certainty and growing dread, that it would not stay buried for long. Returning to Saudi Arabia felt like stepping back into a cage I'd forgotten was locked. The plane touched down in Riyadh on a scorching November afternoon, and within hours, I was swept back into the machinery of royal life, palace meetings, religious obligations, family dinners where my father discussed provincial governance and my uncles debated oil contracts. Everything looked the same, the marble corridors, the golden prayer rugs, the servants moving like silent shadows. But I had changed, and the dissonance was almost unbearable. I resumed my duties flawlessly. I led Friday prayers at our family mosque, my Quranic recitation as perfect as ever. I attended council sessions where governors discussed policy, and clerics interpreted religious law. I smiled at diplomatic receptions and nodded respectfully when imams praised my devotion. Outwardly, I was still Prince Khalid bin Fahd al-Rashid, exemplar of Islamic royalty. Inwardly, I was living a lie that grew heavier every day. At night, alone in my private quarters with the door locked and guards posted outside, I would replay everything I'd read in London. The words of Jesus haunted me, not with condemnation, but with invitation. Come to me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. These phrases circled through my mind during council meetings, during prayers, during every moment I pretended to be someone I was no longer sure I was. The fear was constant and suffocating. I knew exactly what I was risking. Apostasy from Islam, Ridda, carried only one punishment under Saudi law, execution. And unlike the rumors whispered in Western media, this wasn't just theoretical. It was enforced, particularly among royalty. A common citizen might be dealt with quietly, shipped off to a psychiatric facility or pressured to recant. But a prince? A prince from a family known for producing Islamic scholars and religious authorities? A prince would be made an example. Publicly. Irreversibly. I told myself I could maintain the facade forever. I would keep my secret belief locked away, perform the rituals, play the role, and perhaps one day, when I was older and less scrutinized, I could quietly fade from public life. It was cowardice, I knew, but it felt like survival. Then December arrived, and with it, an unbearable pressure. The closer Christmas approached, the more I felt something building inside me, part conviction, part desperation. Every time I prostrated myself in the mosque, I felt like a fraud. Every time I recited verses about Allah's singularity, my heart whispered, but Jesus claimed to be God, and I believe him. The cognitive dissonance was tearing me apart from the inside. My father noticed my distraction. Khalid, you seem troubled, he said one evening after a family dinner. Is something weighing on you? Everything, I wanted to say. Instead, I smiled and blamed it on diplomatic studies, on adjusting to being home, on nothing at all. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Because on 25th December, we have a crucial Royal Council meeting. Foreign dignitaries. State media coverage. The kingdom's eyes will be upon us. I expect you to represent our family with the honor our name deserves. 25th December. Christmas Day. The irony was not lost on me. As the date approached, the pressure mounted from all sides. Royal Council meetings multiplied as preparations intensified. Religious clerics became more visible at palace functions, their presence a constant reminder of the theological authority that governed every aspect of our lives. I attended gathering after gathering, each one feeling like a test I was barely passing. 24th December. I barely slept. I lay awake in the darkness, praying, though I wasn't entirely sure anymore to whom. God, I whispered to the ceiling, I don't know what to do. I can't keep pretending. But I can't speak either. Not without losing everything. No audible answer came. Just silence, and the terrible certainty that the next day would change everything. 25th December dawned clear and hot. By mid-morning, the Royal Council chamber was filling with the kingdom's most powerful men. I took my assigned seat, wearing traditional royal garments, my face carefully neutral. Foreign dignitaries from Gulf states lined one side of the room. Military generals sat rigid in their pressed uniforms. Religious clerics in white robes occupied the elevated section, their presence lending spiritual authority to political proceedings. State media cameras positioned themselves as strategic angels, ready to broadcast carefully edited portions to the nation. The meeting proceeded through its agenda: trade agreements, provincial budgets, security briefings. I participated when required, offering opinions on diplomatic matters, nodding at appropriate moments. Every minute felt like walking on the edge of a blade. As the session drew to a close, Sheikh Abdullah bin Yusuf, one of the kingdom's most prominent clerics, rose to offer closing remarks and a prayer. He was a severe man with a white beard and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. My father respected him deeply. My uncles deferred to his religious rulings. He spoke about vigilance against Western influence, about maintaining Islamic purity in an increasingly corrupt world. His voice rose with passion as he approached his conclusion. Then he said it, the words that would break something inside me. And we thank Allah for protecting us from the lies of Christmas and the false birth of a false God. May we never be deceived by the corrupted tales of those who claim divinity for a mere man. The room murmured in agreement. Ameen. Several voices responded. But something inside me, something that had been building for weeks, for months, since that winter evening in a London bookstore, finally snapped. I stood up. I stood up. The room didn't notice immediately. Council members were still murmuring their agreement with Sheikh Abdullah's prayer, still settling back into their seats. But I remained standing, and slowly, incrementally, the murmurs died away. My father glanced at me, a question in his eyes. Protocol demanded I wait to be acknowledged before speaking. But I was far beyond protocol now. My voice, when it came, didn't shake. It should have. My hands were trembling, my heart was hammering against my ribs, but my voice emerged steady and clear, carrying across the council chamber with a clarity that surprised even me. Today is Christmas, I said. And Jesus Christ is not a lie. The effect was instantaneous and total. The room froze as if time itself had stopped. You could hear the sudden intake of breath from a dozen throats. Someone's teacup slipped from nerveless fingers and shattered against the marble floor, the sound impossibly loud in the shocked silence. Fabric rustled as heads turned toward me in disbelief. A foreign dignitary gasped audibly. Sheikh Abdullah's face went white, then red. His mouth opened, but no words came out. My father stared at me as if I had begun speaking an alien language. His expression cycled through confusion, shock, and then, most painful of all, dawning horror as he understood what I had just done. Khalid, he whispered, his voice barely audible. What did you say? Every eye in the room was on me now. The state media cameras remained fixed in place, but I could see the technicians scrambling, unsure whether to keep recording or cut the feed. Military generals sat rigid, their faces carefully blank. The foreign dignitaries exchanged bewildered glances, uncertain whether they were witnessing political theater or genuine catastrophe. I could have stopped there. I could have claimed momentary confusion, emotional distress, anything to walk it back. My father's desperate expression was giving me one last chance to save myself. Instead, I spoke louder. This day matters, I said, my voice ringing through the chamber. Jesus matters. And I will not deny him. The room erupted. Sheikh Abdullah surged to his feet, his face contorted with rage. Blasphemy, he shouted. This is public apostasy. Guards. My father rose as well, his hand extended toward me. Whether to reach for me or ward me away, I couldn't tell. Khalid, stop this. Stop this now. But I couldn't stop. Something had broken open inside me, and truth was pouring out like water from a cracked dam. Jesus is the Son of God, I continued, even as guards began moving toward me from their positions along the walls. He died for our sins and rose from the dead. He is the way. Silence him. Sheikh Abdullah commanded. The guards surrounded me in seconds, their hands gripping my arms with professional efficiency. The state media cameras finally cut, their red recording lights blinking off in unison. The foreign dignitaries were being quickly ushered from the room by palace officials, their confused protests fading as doors closed behind them. My father stood frozen, his face ashen, one hand pressed against his chest as if physically wounded. Our eyes met for one terrible moment. I saw everything in that look: shock, betrayal, grief, and underneath it all, fear. Not for himself, but for me. He knew, as I knew, what came next. Father, I'm sorry, I whispered, though I wasn't sure he could hear me over the chaos. But I can't lie anymore. He turned away, his shoulders sagging. Within minutes, I was being dragged from the council chamber through corridors I had walked freely my entire life. Clerics gathered in clusters, Their voices raised in outrage and disbelief. The prince has apostatized. He declared faith in the Christian God. In front of state witnesses. The news was already spreading like wildfire through the palace. By the time the sun set that evening, I had been formally stripped of my title and all privileges. No longer Prince Khalid bin Fahd al-Rashid. Just Khalid, apostate, blasphemer, criminal. The charges were read to me by Sheikh Abdullah himself, his voice shaking with fury: public apostasy, denial of Islamic faith, promotion of false religion, bringing shame upon the royal family. There would be no public trial, no lawyers, no appeals to international courts or human rights organizations. Those were for common criminals. I had committed a religious crime, and religious crimes were handled internally, swiftly, and absolutely. The clerics convened that night. Their verdict was unanimous. Execution. At dawn. 3 days from now. They transported me after midnight to a facility I hadn't known existed, a blackside detention center buried beneath the capital, where enemies of the state and religious criminals disappeared without ceremony. The van that carried me there had no windows. The corridors we walked through had no markings. This was a place designed for erasure. The cell they placed me in was narrow and cold despite the desert heat above. Concrete walls on 3 sides, steel bars on the 4th. No windows. No natural light. The only sound was my own breathing and the distant hum of ventilation systems. The door clanged shut behind me. I stood in the center of that cell, still wearing my royal garments now torn and dusty from rough handling, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had done. I had just destroyed my life for 3 forbidden words. And despite everything, the fear, the loss, the certainty of death, I could not bring myself to regret them. The first night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the thin mattress that served as my bed, back against the cold concrete wall, and tried to process what had happened. Hours ago, I had been Prince Khalid bin Fahd al-Rashid, sitting in a royal council chamber surrounded by the kingdom's most powerful men. Now I was just prisoner number 7294 in an underground facility that officially didn't exist. The cell was barely 2 meters wide. Concrete floor, concrete walls painted institutional gray, steel bars separating me from a dimly lit corridor where no one passed. The air tasted stale and recycled. The only sounds were my own breathing and the occasional metallic groan of pipes somewhere in the walls. No windows meant no way to track time except by the meals they slid through a slot in the bars, morning, noon, evening, measured in paper plates of rice and flatbread. I replayed the council meeting in my mind, over and over. My voice saying those words. The shock on every face. My father's expression. Had there been another way? Could I have been wiser, more strategic, less public? Maybe I should have stayed silent, waited, planned some kind of escape before declaring my faith. But even as these thoughts circled, I knew the truth. Silence was no longer possible. I had tried it for weeks, and it was killing me from the inside. Sometimes the only way forward is through, even when through means destruction. The second night, fear found me. Not fear of death. I had accepted that the moment I stood up in that council chamber. But a different, more insidious fear, the fear that I had been wrong. That I had thrown away everything, my family, my future, my life, for a beautiful story that was ultimately just a story. What if the clerics were right? What if Jesus was merely a prophet, and I had committed blasphemy by elevating him to divinity? What if I was about to die not as a martyr but as a fool? The cell seemed to grow colder. The darkness pressed in. My breathing quickened. Jesus, I whispered into that darkness, my voice cracking. If you are real, don't let my last act be foolishness. Please. I need to know. I need to know this wasn't a mistake. The words hung in the air, swallowed by concrete and steel. Silence. And then, something. It wasn't a voice, not audible to my ears. It wasn't a vision. My eyes saw only the same gray walls and dim corridor light. But the cell filled with a presence so tangible, so overwhelmingly real, that I gasped. A peace descended that had no earthly source, not calm resignation, not self-delusion, not emotional numbness. This was something other. Someone other. I wasn't alone. I knew it with the same certainty I knew my own name. Someone was in that cell with me, and he was not afraid. The peace was so profound it seemed almost physical, like water washing over burnt skin. My racing heart slowed. My trembling hands steadied. A thought settled into my mind, not my own thought, but planted there like a seed from outside myself. You are not dying. You are being seen. Tears streamed down my face, but for the first time in 3 days, they weren't tears of fear or regret. They were tears of recognition. This was what I had been searching for my entire life, not religious certainty, not theological correctness, but presence. God close enough to enter a prison cell. God who sees when no one else does. I slept that night more deeply than I had in months. The third day dawned, though I only knew it by the meal they brought. The guard who slid the tray through the slot wouldn't meet my eyes. Word had spread about who I was and what I'd done. Even here, among hardened criminals and political prisoners, apostasy from the royal family was shocking. The tray held more food than usual. The final meal before execution, I realized. Rice with lamb, dates, fresh bread. I ate mechanically, not tasting it. The peace from the night before remained, a steady flame that fear couldn't extinguish. Afternoon came. Evening. I prayed, not Islamic prayers with prescribed postures and memorized verses, but simple conversation with the one I now knew was listening. I thank him for London, for the bookstore, for the book that changed everything. I thanked him for the courage to speak truth, even when it cost me everything. I asked him to comfort my father, who must be devastated. I asked him to use even this, especially this, for purposes I couldn't see. A guard appeared at my cell as darkness fell. Your family has been notified of the execution time, he said stiffly. Dawn tomorrow. They have declined to attend. The shame was too great. My father, the man who had governed provinces with unshakable authority, could not bring himself to watch his son die as an apostate. I understood. In some ways, it was mercy. I didn't want my last sight on earth to be his face twisted with grief and disgrace. Thank you, I said quietly. The guard looked surprised, then uncomfortable. He left without another word. I lay on the mattress as the facility quieted for the night. Tomorrow was 25th December, Christmas Day. The symmetry was almost beautiful. I would die on the day celebrating Jesus' birth. Born in a stable, crucified on a cross, followed by a prince who would be executed on his birthday. Worse endings existed. The hours crawled past. I drifted in and out of sleep, the peace still anchoring me even as adrenaline tried to surge. Somewhere around 4 a.m., I heard movement in the corridor, boots on concrete, keys jangling, low voices. They were coming. I stood up, smoothed my torn garments, and waited. The cell door swung open. Guards entered, carrying white execution garments and chains. It's time, one said. I nodded and let them dress me, let them shackle my hands. As they led me from the cell into the corridor, I whispered one final prayer. Into your hands, I commit my spirit. Christmas morning had arrived. They led me through corridors I had never seen, service tunnels and maintenance passages that ran beneath the official government buildings like hidden veins. These were the pathways of erasure, routes designed to move prisoners without being seen, to make people disappear without documentation or witness. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had walked the marble halls above as royalty, where servants bowed and officials stepped aside. Now I shuffled through concrete tunnels in chains, heading toward an execution ground that wouldn't appear in any official record. The white garments they dressed me in were traditional, simple, clean, meant to face death with dignity. My hands were shackled in front of me, the metal cold against my wrists. 4 guards surrounded me, their faces professionally blank. No one spoke. The only sounds were footsteps echoing off tunnel walls and the soft clink of chains with each step I took. We climbed a staircase, passed through a heavy door, and suddenly we were outside. The execution ground was located in a courtyard behind the detention facility, enclosed by high concrete walls and completely hidden from public view. This wasn't the kind of public execution meant to deter others. Those happened in city squares with crowds gathered. This was different. Official. Witnessed by select clerics and government officials who needed to confirm the sentence had been carried out, but private enough to spare the royal family additional scandal. About 20 men stood in a semicircle at the far end of the courtyard. I recognized several faces: Sheikh Abdullah, his expression stern and satisfied. 2 military officers I'd seen at palace functions. Several other clerics whose names I couldn't remember. All of them perfectly still, perfectly silent, watching as guards led me to the center of the courtyard where a single chair waited. The sky was lightening with pre-dawn gray. Riyadh was beginning to wake, ordinary people preparing for ordinary days, completely unaware that a prince was about to die a few kilometers away. They positioned me in front of the chair, but didn't make me sit. The executioner stood 10 paces away, a large man in traditional dress, his face covered except for his eyes. He held no sword. Execution for apostasy in this facility was carried out differently. More efficiently. More finally. He raised his hand, signaling readiness. Sheikh Abdullah stepped forward to pronounce the final judgment. His voice carried across the courtyard, "Khalid bin Fahd al-Rashid, you have been found guilty of apostasy from Islam and public blasphemy. The sentence is..." The power failed. Every light in the facility went dark simultaneously. The floodlights illuminating the courtyard, the security lights along the walls, the glowing windows of the building behind us, all extinguished in an instant, plunging us into pre-dawn darkness. Confused shouts erupted. "Generator!" Someone yelled. "Switch to backup power." But the backup generators didn't engage. The darkness remained absolute, broken only by the growing gray of approaching dawn. Then the confusion turned to chaos. A sound like thunder split the air. Impossible, because Riyadh's winter skies don't produce thunderstorms. But there it was, a deafening crack followed by the shriek of metal tearing. Lightning, completely out of season, violating every meteorological pattern, struck the communications tower attached to the detention facility. The impact was catastrophic. Sparks showered down like burning rain. Alarms began wailing, not the organized alert of a drill, but the panicked screaming of systems failing all at once. Secondary explosions rippled through the electrical infrastructure. Fires broke out where the lightning had struck, orange flames licking up the communications tower and spreading to nearby structures. Men were shouting, running, colliding with each other in the darkness and smoke. The witnesses scattered. Sheikh Abdullah stumbled backward, his white robes billowing. The executioner stood frozen, his hands still raised, staring at the chaos with visible shock. More metal tearing, this time from the detention facility itself. A blast door that should have been locked, that had no reason to malfunction, suddenly groaned and slid open with a grinding shriek. Through the opening, I could see corridors flooding with smoke. Other prisoners were emerging, confused, cuffing, moving toward the unexpected breach. A guard grabbed my arm, not roughly, not to restrain me, but pulling me away from the center of the courtyard where debris was beginning to fall. "Move!" he shouted over the alarms. I stumbled after him, my shackled hands making balance difficult. But then he stopped, turned to look at me, and something in his eyes shifted. Fear, maybe, or recognition, or something else I couldn't name. "Run," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "What?" His grip on my arm tightened, then released. "I don't know why," he said, shaking his head as if arguing with himself. "I don't know why, but run. Now." He didn't wait for my response. He simply turned and disappeared into the smoke and confusion, leaving me standing there, shackled but unguarded, 10 meters from an open blast door. I didn't question it. I ran. Through smoke that burned my lungs. Through corridors filling with panicked prisoners and overwhelmed guards. Through passages I didn't recognize, following only the instinct to move forward, away, out. The shackles made it awkward, but adrenaline overrode everything else. I found a stairwell. Climbed. Emerged into a different corridor. Saw daylight through a breach in the outer wall where the explosions had torn through concrete. I squeezed through the gap, scraping my arms and shoulders, and suddenly I was outside the compound, standing in a service area where supply trucks usually parked. One truck sat there, engine running, driver's door open as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. I didn't stop to wonder why it was running. Why it was unattended. Why every impossible circumstance was aligning to create a path where no path should exist. I climbed into the truck, my shackled hands fumbling with the steering wheel. Put it in gear. And drove, blindly, desperately, away from the facility as dawn broke over Riyadh. Behind me, sirens wailed and smoke rose into the morning sky. Ahead of me, the city streets gave way to highway, and the highway dissolved into desert. I drove until buildings disappeared, until the road became sand, until the desert swallowed everything, and I finally let myself believe what was happening. I was alive. On Christmas morning, I was alive. The desert has no mercy for the unprepared. I drove the stolen supply truck until the fuel gauge dropped to empty, following roads that deteriorated from asphalt to gravel to barely visible tracks in the sand. I had no map, no water, no plan beyond the single desperate instinct: get away. The sun climbed higher, transforming the truck's cabin into an oven. My white execution garments, designed for a death that lasted minutes, offered no protection against the relentless heat. When the engine finally coughed and died, I was somewhere in the empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, where sand dunes stretched endlessly in every direction and the horizon shimmered with heat mirages. I climbed out of the truck on legs that barely supported me, my shackled hands still bound, and stared at the vast emptiness surrounding me. I had escaped execution only to die of exposure in the desert. The irony would have been funny if I'd had the energy to laugh. I walked because staying still felt like giving up. I stumbled through sand that shifted beneath my feet, each step requiring enormous effort. The sun hammered down. Thirst clawed at my throat. My vision began to blur at the edges. How long could a man survive out here without water? Hours? A day at most? I collapsed sometime in the afternoon, no longer able to force my legs to move. The sand was scorching against my face, but I couldn't find the strength to lift my head. This was it, then. I had survived the execution only to die alone under the pitiless sky. Jesus, I whispered into the sand, my voice barely audible. I trust you. Even here. Even now. Then darkness took me. I woke to the sound of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones, but not Arabic. The language was unfamiliar, maybe Tagalog or Malayalam. I felt hands lifting me, water touching my cracked lips, shade covering my face. He's alive, someone said in accented English. Praise God, he's still alive. The faces swimming above me were brown and weathered by desert sun, foreign workers, I realized dimly. Filipinos or Indians, the kind of laborers who maintained oil facilities and construction sites throughout Saudi Arabia, living on the margins of our society, invisible to most Saudis except when their work was needed. But these weren't just any workers. As consciousness slowly returned over the next hours, I learned the impossible truth. They were Christians. Secret believers who gathered in hidden house churches, who risked everything to worship Jesus in a kingdom where their faith was forbidden. They had been traveling between remote work sites when they spotted my collapsed form in the distance. "We thought you were dead," one man told me as I lay on a mat in the back of their van, sipping water slowly. His name was Manujal, a construction supervisor from the Philippines. "But we couldn't leave you there without checking. God wouldn't let us drive past." When they saw my shackles and white garments, they understood immediately what I was, an escaped prisoner, likely condemned to death. Any Saudi who found me would return me to authorities. Harboring me was dangerous beyond measure. Discovery would mean immediate deportation at best, imprisonment or execution at worst. Yet they didn't hesitate. "You are our brother," Manuza said simply. "If Jesus was executed for speaking truth, we can risk our lives to save someone who did the same." They took me to a hidden compound, a ramshackle collection of shipping containers converted into living quarters at an abandoned construction site deep in the desert. 20 or so foreign workers lived there semi-permanently, officially maintaining equipment but actually creating a space where they could worship freely, away from surveillance and religious police. For the first week, I could barely move. The desert exposure had ravaged my body, severe dehydration, sun poisoning, infected scrapes from my escape. They nursed me with surprising medical knowledge, shared from a group that had learned to care for their own since Saudi hospitals asked too many questions. But more than physical healing, they offered something I desperately needed: spiritual strengthening. These believers had maintained their faith under constant threat for years, some for decades. They had lost friends to deportation and imprisonment. Yet they gathered every evening in that converted shipping container to sing hymns in whispered voices, to pray with fierce conviction, to study smuggled Bibles worn from constant reading. "We are the church that no one sees," an elderly Indian woman named Priya told me. "But Jesus sees us. That's enough." As I recovered, I learned about the underground network of secret Christians scattered throughout Saudi Arabia: Filipinos, Indians, Ethiopians, Koreans, even a handful of Saudi converts like myself. They communicated through coded messages, supported each other through clandestine meetings, and helped desperate believers escape when necessary. "You are not the first Saudi we've helped," Manujal admitted. "There are others. Not many, but some. Faith has a way of breaking through even the thickest walls." By the third week, we were planning my escape. A false identity was prepared, paperwork identifying me as a Filipino construction worker named Miguel Santos. My Arabic was too fluent, my bearing too royal, but with my sun-darkened skin, gaunt frame from desert exposure, and workman's clothes, I could pass cursory inspection. Maybe. The plan was risky: drive to the Jordanian border with a work crew on legitimate business, cross with forged documents during the controlled chaos of shift changes. The believers had done this before, smuggling desperate converts out hidden among authorized workers. We waited for the right opportunity. Days turned into weeks. I grew stronger, helped with their work, learned their hymns. Christmas passed quietly. We celebrated in secret with bread and grape juice, remembering Jesus' birth and thanking him for my miraculous survival. Early February, the moment came. A legitimate border crossing, authorized work crew, careful timing. I climbed into the back of a truck with 10 other workers, my forged papers tucked in my shirt pocket, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain the guards would hear it. The crossing took 3 hours of tense waiting, document inspection, random searches. I kept my eyes down, my hands calloused from weeks of construction work, my story rehearsed until it felt almost real. When the guard glanced at my paperwork, then at my face, I thought everything would unravel. He stamped the document and waved us through. Jordan. Freedom. The first breath of air outside Saudi Arabia. As a believer, felt like being born again. The Christians who had saved me embraced me at a safe house across the border, tears streaming down weathered faces. "You are free," Manus said. "Jesus brought you through the fire." I stayed with them for another month, recovering fully, connecting with churches that helped refugees and converts. Then I moved again, farther from the kingdom, deeper into safety, toward a new life I was still learning to navigate. Months passed. I found work, found a church community, found ways to help other converts escaping similar situations. My name was no longer Prince Khalid. My family believed I was dead. Saudi Arabia had erased me from official records. But I had never been more alive. As December approached again and Christmas decorations began appearing in shop windows, I marveled at the impossible journey, from palace to prison to desert to freedom, all because of 3 forbidden words spoken on a Christmas morning. 25th December arrived again, exactly 1 year after I should have died. The church where I now worshipped was small, tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Amman, Jordan. Nothing like the grand mosques of my childhood, with their towering minarets and marble courtyards. Just a converted warehouse with plastic chairs, a modest sound system, and about 50 believers who gathered every Sunday to worship without fear of arrest. But it felt more like home than any palace ever had. Pastor David, a Jordanian believer who led the congregation, had asked me weeks earlier if I wanted to be baptized on Christmas Day. "It seems fitting," he'd said with a gentle smile. "A year ago, Jesus saved your life. Now you can publicly declare that your life belongs to Him." I had hesitated. Not because I doubted, but because even here, hundreds of miles from Saudi Arabia, fear had a way of lingering. Public declarations had cost me everything once before. But Pastor David had squeezed my shoulder and said, "Brother, you are already free. Baptism is just making visible what's already true." So on Christmas morning, as the congregation sang hymns in Arabic and English, I stood before them in simple clothes, ready to step into the water. The baptismal pool was nothing elaborate, a simple tank installed at the front of the church. But as I waded in, the water lapping against my waist, I felt the weight of everything I was about to do. This wasn't just a ritual. This was a burial and a resurrection. The old Khalid, prince, performer, prisoner, would be submerged beneath the water, and someone new would rise. Pastor David stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "Khalid," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet church, "do you confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, that He died for your sins and rose again, and that you commit your life fully to Him?" "I do," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "Then I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." He placed his hand over my nose and mouth, supporting my back with his other arm. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and let myself fall backward into the water. Buried with Christ. For a moment, I was completely submerged, surrounded by water, everything muffled and distant. I thought of the cell where I'd awaited execution, the desert where I'd collapsed, the truck that carried me to freedom, every death I'd survived. Then hands lifted me up, and I broke through the surface, gasping, water streaming down my face. Raised with Him. The congregation erupted in applause and shouts of, "Amen." I stood there in the water, overwhelmed, tears mixing with baptismal water, and felt something settle deep in my soul. I am His, and He is mine. Nothing can change that now. Later, as the church celebrated with a simple meal of rice and lamb, believers came to embrace me one by one. Many of them were refugees like me, Syrians who would fled war, Iraqis escaping persecution, Sudanese believers driven from their homeland. We were all exiles. We were all survivors. We were all held together by the same truth: Jesus is worth losing everything for. My new identity was strange and beautiful. I was no longer Prince Khalid bin Fahd al-Rashid, bearer of a name that commanded instant respect across the Middle East. I was just Khalid now, or sometimes Brother Khalid, or occasionally, the Saudi brother, when my story needed telling. I worked a simple job at a construction company. I lived in a modest apartment. I owned almost nothing. And yet I possessed everything that mattered. The losses were real and painful. My family believed I was dead, killed during the chaos of the execution morning, erased as an embarrassment to the royal name. I couldn't contact them without endangering both them and myself. My father would never know I survived. My mother would grieve a son who wasn't actually gone. The weight of that knowledge pressed on me during quiet moments. I couldn't return home. Saudi Arabia's borders were permanently closed to me. If I ever set foot in the kingdom again, I would be arrested immediately, and the execution would proceed without interruption this time. Everything familiar, the language of my childhood, the landscape I'd grown up in, the culture that shaped me, was now forbidden territory. But the gains were immeasurable. For the first time in my life, I knew what it meant to have a genuine relationship with God. Not performance. Not religious obligation. Not desperate prayers launched toward a distant deity who might or might not be listening. Instead, I had communion, daily conversation with a God who had proven his presence in a prison cell and his power on an execution ground. I was more alive in exile than I'd ever been in a palace. My mission emerged naturally from my experience. Other secret believers, Saudi converts living in terror, foreign workers maintaining hidden faith, refugees fleeing persecution, began finding their way to me. They'd heard about the prince who survived. They wanted to know if the story was true, if Jesus really intervened. I met with them in quiet cafes, in church basements, in living rooms where curtains were drawn against curious eyes. I shared my testimony dozens of times, each telling both painful and cathartic. I watched hope kindle in eyes that had been dimmed by fear. I helped believers plan escapes, connected them with networks that could assist, prayed with them as they prepared to risk everything for truth. Your story gives us courage, a young Saudi man told me once, his hand shaking as he clutched a coffee cup. If Jesus could save a prince on an execution ground, maybe he can save me too. He can, I assured him. He already has. You just have to trust him enough to walk through the door he opens. I reflected often on that Christmas morning, the miraculous intervention that defied every natural law. Lightning in the wrong season. Power failures cascading at the exact moment of execution. A guard who released me for reasons he couldn't explain. An abandoned truck with its engine running. Every impossible circumstance aligning to create a path where no path should exist. Skeptics would call it coincidence, luck, fortunate timing. But I knew better. I had felt the presence in my cell the night before. I had heard the message, "You are not dying. You are being seen." And I had watched with my own eyes as heaven reached down into a Saudi detention facility and said, "Not today. This one is mine." If Jesus could step into that execution ground, into the heart of a kingdom where his name was forbidden, then he could step into any darkness, any prison, any impossible situation. He had not stopped intervening. He would never stop. And neither would I stop testifying to what I had seen. I'm telling you this story from a small apartment in Amman, Jordan, where I've lived for the past year and a half as a refugee. Outside my window, the city hums with ordinary life, cars honking, children playing, merchants calling out their wares. I work construction during the day, attend church on Sundays, and spend my evenings meeting with other believers who have escaped persecution or helping those still planning their escape. It's not the life I was born into, but it's the life I was born for. Some people ask me why I share this testimony so openly. Isn't it dangerous? Couldn't Saudi authorities still be looking for me? Couldn't telling this story put me at risk? The answer to all those questions is yes. But this story isn't mine to keep silent about. When God intervenes so dramatically, so undeniably, you don't hide it. You shout it from the rooftops, or in this case, from YouTube videos and church platforms and anywhere people will listen. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that miracles still happen. That Jesus still moves. That faith is worth the cost. Let me be clear about something. Persecution is real. It's not ancient history confined to Bible stories and Roman coliseums. Right now, in Saudi Arabia and dozens of other nations, believers are being imprisoned, tortured, and executed for following Jesus. Secret Christians worship in hidden rooms, whispering prayers and singing silent hymns because speaking too loudly could mean death. This isn't sensationalism. This is reality. And into that reality, Jesus continues to intervene in ways that defy explanation. Lightning strikes that shouldn't happen. Guards who release prisoners for reasons they can't articulate. Doors that open when they should stay locked. Provision that appears exactly when it's needed. He hasn't stopped moving in impossible situations. He's just waiting for people to trust him enough to step into those situations. If you are watching this from a place of darkness, maybe you are facing persecution, or living with secret faith in a hostile environment, or feeling trapped by circumstances that seem impossible, hear me. Jesus can step into your darkness. I know it feels overwhelming. I know the cost seems too high. But he specializes in impossible rescues. He proved it on a Saudi execution ground. He'll prove it for you too. If you're afraid to speak truth because you know what it will cost, family rejection, career loss, social isolation, or worse, I understand that fear intimately. I lived with it for months. But I also learned this: silence has its own cost. It costs your integrity, your authenticity, your peace. And ultimately, it costs more than speaking ever could. Truth is worth the price. Every single time. If you are doubting whether Jesus is real, whether faith makes any difference, whether God actually intervenes in human affairs, I offer my life as evidence. I should be dead. According to every natural law and political reality, I should have been executed on that Christmas morning. But I'm here, alive, free, testifying that something beyond human power reached into that execution ground and said, "Not today." That's not coincidence. That's intervention. And it's available to anyone who calls on his name. Maybe you've never considered Jesus before. Maybe you've heard his name but dismissed him as a historical figure or a prophet or a myth created by Western culture. Let me tell you what I discovered. Jesus is none of those things. He's not a distant deity demanding perfection. He's not a harsh judge waiting to condemn your failures. He's God who became human specifically to enter suffering, to touch brokenness, to offer a relationship based on grace rather than performance. He came close enough to bleed. He died to bridge the gap between us and God. And he rose to prove that death doesn't have the final word. That's the Jesus I met in a London bookstore and followed to an execution ground. That's the Jesus who filled my prison cell with peace and orchestrated an impossible escape. That's the Jesus I serve today, not because I have to, but because once you encounter him, you can't imagine life without him. 3 forbidden words changed everything for me. Today is Christmas. 3 simple words acknowledging a truth that powerful men didn't want spoken. But those words weren't just about a calendar date or a Western holiday. They were about recognizing that God had stepped into human history, that divinity had chosen to enter our suffering, that heaven had invaded earth. And once you recognize that truth, you can't unsee it. I no longer live as a prince. I gave up palaces and power, wealth and prestige, family connections and future governance. But I didn't lose anything that mattered. I traded performance for relationship, distance for presence, fear for peace. I live as a witness now. And honestly, it's the most fulfilling existence I've ever known. So here's my invitation to you. Consider Jesus. Not religion. Not ritual. Not Western Christianity or Eastern tradition or any cultural package. Just Jesus, the one who enters execution grounds and prison cells and impossible situations. The one who says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy-laden, and I will give you rest." He's still saying that today. To you. Wherever you are. Whatever you are facing. If this story resonated with you, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who might need to hear it. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love hearing from believers around the world. Your engagement helps YouTube show these testimonies to more people who desperately need hope. And please, pray for secret believers in restricted nations. Pray for Saudi Arabia. Pray for courage for those living double lives. Pray for miraculous interventions like the one I experienced. Because here's what I've learned. Jesus can reach anyone, anywhere, even in the most forbidden places. Even a palace in Riyadh. Even an execution ground at dawn. Even your heart, right now, wherever you're watching this. He's still intervening. He's still saving. He's still worth everything. May you discover that truth for yourself. And may you have the courage to follow him, no matter the cost. Because I promise you, he's worth it.